As you know, one of the things we're confronting is the deficit in the rule of law and the deficit in democracy. We've been documenting that for days. Today, we're going to talk about the problems confronting the civic space, and as you can see behind me, 84% of countries have declined in terms of the civic space. There's been a shrinking of the civic space, and only a very small percentage have improved. My name is Margaret Levy. I'm a professor emerita of political science at Stanford University and a fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law there, where it turns out Flavia was a fellow last summer. So we're very delighted that she's here for many reasons. What I'm going to do is, the purpose of this panel is really to address how civil society groups and organizations are managing this decline in the civic space and how they can begin to address it in order to not only make democracy more vital again, also to improve and enhance the rule of law, but also to create an environment in which citizens, businesses, communities can thrive. And we have a remarkable set of panelists here. I'll introduce who they are, and then I'm going to let them speak for a very few minutes. We've been practicing this. And they will tell you a little bit about their organizations and the challenges that they face, what wakes them up in the middle of the night, that they have to confront the next day, how they wake up in the morning and ready to get to work on some major set of problems. We'll then have a conversation. Hopefully we'll have a real conversation. I've encouraged our panelists to interrupt each other and to ask questions politely. And if we have time, and we're planning to have time, to give you all a chance to ask some questions before we close and see a short movie about another one of our challenge winners, Flavia's group having been one of them. You saw a film about her group earlier in the program. And after I introduce them, and one of the things I want them to do is to correct my pronunciation of their names. So I will try, but then as they introduce their organizations, they can make sure I said it right. I'm starting with Sirpa Rautio.
Very well.
Who is director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, known as FRA. We'll then turn to Aidan Eyakuze, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership. Then Amelia Diaz is the Executive Director of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And finally, Flavia Pellegrino, who is the Executive Director of Pacto per la Democrazia. They all have remarkable contributions that they've already made to the rule of law and to the development of civil society. So I encourage you to read their bios rather than my repeating them to you on stage today. So Sirpa, let's turn to you for a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of World Justice Project and the index I've been following for a long time. About Fundamental Rights Agency, it's an EU agency based in Vienna. It's independent, which means that governments don't decide our program. We plan it ourselves. But of course, we work with EU institutions. We work at two levels: EU level and then national level and local level, of course, as well. I will focus mainly on what we do with civil society, but I have to say that I have only when I was very young worked for civil society. I have always worked for intergovernmental organizations or for independent human rights institutions. So that's my background. So I'm a bit of an outsider to the civil society, but of course we are working with civil society and supporting, but I cannot speak for civil society. I started as a refugee lawyer with the civil society way back, actually in this town. I had my first job. Fundamental Rights Agency is best known for its data collection. We have always been doing research, collecting data, not only on civil society, on many, many issues. But it's not enough to collect data. We are also more and more looking what more can we do. And of course, we have been working with civil society, supporting them. We have a civic society platform with more than 1,000 civil society, which is an active platform, not a dead roster. We really use it for consultation and information sharing. We, of course, meet civil society wherever we go, and we often meet and try to sort of convene civil society. We had a great civil society monitoring meeting last September, while my colleague who is here was in charge of that, and really looking at how we can work more effectively together. So we monitor, we do research, we do cooperate. We are planning more and more how we can take action. We have now recently also gone public criticizing the Hungarian government, which is not something FRA has often done. We also do legal work, look at especially EU lawmaking. So it's a very broad set of activities that we do. All this in context of working on rule of law, fundamental rights, democracy as a whole, with many other many EU initiatives, but also at the national level. And I stop there to keep to the time that I promised.
In your case, you're totally funded by the EU, is that right?
Yes.
With some money from the Norwegian Sovereignty Fund.
That's right. For human rights organization, I think we still have a healthy budget and fairly good resources, which is even more responsibility for us to do more. So we have an EU subsidy, which means that EU is funding us. So far, no real threats of cutting, although there are some voices, of course. And then we are indeed working with the Norway grants, and especially with civil society, national human rights structures, and Roma, we will be having more funding to do more operational work.
And what challenge keeps you up at night? What's the thing that just really worries you?
Well, quite frankly, I worry most about the conflicts that we have at the moment. I'm following very closely, of course, Middle East, but also Ukraine, Russia. I'm from Finland, so Russia has always been something we watch closely. But more recently, of course, Middle East and the threat of massive escalation looks better now, but that keeps me awake. But also the impact it has then on our work, also within EU, which is where we work.
Thank you. Aidan.
Good morning. Thank you so much. So I'm Chief Executive of the Open Government Partnership. It's a partnership that brings together civil society and governments. It was formed in 2011 on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly there by 8 governments and 9 civil society organizations. And the main objective is to make sure that governments are responsive to the needs and the priorities of the citizens they serve as expressed and articulated by the citizens themselves. So this is where civil society is very important. This is a platform where governments and civil society leaders at global level, at national level, and even at subnational level sit together. And one of the most important aspects of Open Government Partnership is that we are an action-oriented organization. It is quite nice to make statements of principles and policy, but we encourage governments to create action plans, national action plans, local action plans that last 2 years, now we're going to 4 years, where they commit to change, to reform, to policy reform, to administrative reform in directions that make government much more transparent to citizens, whether it's access to information, open procurement, much more inclusive of citizens' engagement, so public participation in policy making, and the third one, most important, is it's more accountable to citizens. So with this action-oriented platform, 5,600 commitments have been created over the period of about 13 and a half years by governments working closely with civil society organizations. And the close participation of civil society, we've looked at the data, the close participation of civil society in the creation of these commitments for transformation makes them more ambitious, more likely to be completed, and more likely to have an impact, a positive impact in how government operates and how citizens are actually experiencing the delivery of services by governments.
So how are you funded?
So we're funded by 3 groups of entities, let me call them that way. One is the member governments themselves. So OGP now has 74 government members, purely voluntarily joined us. And they fund about a quarter of our budget through voluntary membership fees. We upped them just a year ago, and many more governments are actually paying the higher fee, voluntary fee. The second group are actually bilateral. So party like Sirpa's organization, we have bilateral agreements with the European Union, working, for example, in our countries in the Eastern Partnership, so the Balkans, etc. And of course, in Africa, the Caribbean, on another contract. So the EU, the FCDO of the UK, when USAID was still alive, they also funded us. The French government, the Swedish government, the Canadian government. So we have a group of bilaterals who are supporting our work. And the third are private foundations who are been very supportive. Ford, OSF, Hewlett Foundation, Mott Foundation. So these
OSF is Open Society Foundation.
Open Society Foundations, yes. So this is the third group of private philanthropy that
we'll come back to the private philanthropy because that's clearly under pressure right now. What keeps you up at night?
Well, what keeps me up and motivates me every morning is, given all of this pressure that civil society organizations are facing in the world, intensified even more recently, that our colleagues are getting exhausted. They're getting disillusioned, and they're getting, disengaging from this. It's too much hard work. Let me look after my own mental health. And we have to, I think, be very mindful of the fact that this is the reality that they're facing. So I think one way, and I hope we'll talk about it, one way to keep the energy going, to keep them motivated, is actually talk about the victories and the positive impacts that we are having. Sometimes it can seem very small and insignificant, but it makes a difference. And I think we need to remind ourselves that we are indeed effective as a collective of civil society organizations, and to use that as fuel, as energy to keep us going.
We'll certainly come back to that. Amelia.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure being here. I'm with the Global Investigative Journalism Network. We have 263 member organizations in 97 countries. And our member organizations are either nonprofit media that focus on doing the investigations and holding the powers to account, or support investigative journalists around the world. Our mission is strengthen and empower investigative journalists around the world, and we pay special attention to journalists under repressive regimes and marginalized communities. But we serve the whole global investigative journalism community. Same like as we are gathered here every 2 years, the global investigative journalism community gathers, and we organize the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. Last time we had it in Sweden, and we had over 2,000 journalists from 113 countries and territories. And what we do there is share knowledge, share tools on how to investigate many of the topics that are affecting citizens around the world. At GIGN, besides gathering, and I mentioned the conference at the beginning because that's how we started over 20 years ago, because the topics we're investigating are so complex that we need to help each other and we need to collaborate. So at GIGN, we provide resources and we gather the methodologies on how to do these investigations on topics that are so complex. That goes from money laundering, corruption cases, but also climate change or holding tech accountable. The range is quite big. And those resources are available for free for the whole community and in 14 languages. We have a network of editors working closely with our community in the different regions. And at the same time, we do have a help desk that supports the community. Last year, we answered over 2,400 queries from journalists from around the world who are doing their investigations. And that goes from connecting members from the community while they are investigating topics, but also when journalists are under risk, and then building bridges and connecting with other organizations that can support their work. I will leave it there because there's a lot to talk about, and I know you have 2 other questions, and I can share a lot of knowledge on how our community has faced many of the challenges. I have been part of many of the efforts, even jobs before the one I have now at GIGN, but there has been a lot of learning from our side on how we can still hold powers to account while we are under threat.
And we want to learn those lessons. So how are you funded?
Well, basically, most of our funding comes from philanthropic organizations, Open Society Foundations, Luminate Group, Porticus, David and Riva Logan Foundation, Humanity United, and many other philanthropic groups. So those are Oak Foundation. Those are some of the largest supporters for us, but like they are different scale family foundations, and then some smaller part also from individuals. So that's the main source of our funding.
And what keeps you up at night?
Well, many things, actually.
Yeah.
I was looking, and there is another organization that is the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and 2024 was the deadliest year for journalists. Last year, like the number of journalists killed raised to 124, and the largest group was for journalists who were in Gaza, reporting on the war. Same numbers from the Committee to Protect Journalists. As of December 1st, 2024, 361 journalists were in prison. That includes some of our member organizations. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, some of recently, Klub and Temir of Life, like the government has decided to imprison journalists who are doing their work, just informing the audience. But that is probably, and you are familiarized with these unfortunate numbers, but there are other things that keep us awake and that are affecting the journalism community. Some of those things are also connected to the rule of law. SLAPs are used regularly to target journalists. The nonprofit regulations, so as independent media, many of those are nonprofits, basically are used to affect their funding or say you're no longer, just to kind of like to try to kill the organizations. Then some are targeted as undesirable organizations, so it's not good that you're a journalist in your country. The financial struggles, like there has been lots of shifts, not only on philanthropic organizations, the USAID case affected 1/3 of our membership. Disinformation, digital threats, personal risks, all of those are under the list of things that are keeping us awake.
And I imagine the kind of exhaustion that Aidan's talking about as well.
Correct, but I wanted to end this with something. I was looking at the Rule of Law Index, and I come from the country that is at the bottom of the index, 142. But what I can say is journalists, even in exile, from my home country, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, Belarus, and many other countries, are still doing the journalism. Despite this, they're holding the powers to account. They are finding ways, even from exile or in their countries, despite these threats, of being resilient and being together and doing the investigations. So investigative journalism has not stopped despite all of these things that we're talking about.
Congratulations. It's amazing. Flavia.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It is a huge pleasure to be here and to join this such important panel. I'm the executive director at Pacto pela Democracia, which means Pact for Democracy, that is a broad and cross-ideological coalition in Brazil that orchestrates the democratic ecosystem in civil society in order to counter authoritarian threats, defend the rule of law, and revitalize the democratic environment in the country. And Pacto comprises over 200 civil society organizations that work with different agendas, that have different strategies of action, and also different political identities, political perspectives. And Pacto was created back in 2016, 2018, to respond to a moment where we saw this deep distrust in the Brazilian political and democratic system, a huge fragility in Brazilian democratic culture, and the rise of anti-democratic forces. So we anticipated, Pacto is not a response. I think it's important to say that Pacto is not a response to the election of an autocrat, as we did in Brazil back in 2018. Of course, we played a major role in countering this authoritarian moment, but and this is one of the things I'll be talking about later today in the coalition building session. That is how can, and Pacto is the result of this anticipation of understanding and feeling that there is, that the challenges for our democracy were at really important stake. So yes, and I think the last thing I'll say about Pacto now is that I think one of the things that makes it unique in some ways that Pacto focus on the proper functioning, I would say, of the democratic system in Brazil. So in the way it works, the rules of the game, the democratic processes. So what is like the structure of Brazilian democracy?
The film focused on your civic education role.
Yeah, protecting the integrity of elections back in 2022. That was one of our major efforts that has been also recognized by the World Justice Challenge last year. And so we focus on this structure of democracy in Brazil and as a coalition. And meanwhile, the organizations that are part of our network, and of course, other social actors, they keep leading the fights for rights and for the programmatic agenda that are so important for deepening democracy. But as a coalition, as a group, we focus on how it works, and I've been saying that is how can we guarantee democratic conditions for the rights, for the fights for rights and freedoms can thrive. So that is the way we
and
focus
Flavia,
on
how
work.
are you supported? Who are your donors?
Mostly private philanthropy. And also we do have some support from agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy is going to an end because the Brazilian portfolio is being shut down.
Yeah.
We know how challenging it's been for these agencies in the US, but it's mostly we're funded by the private philanthropy.
Yeah. And what keeps you up at night?
Wow. I could list a lot of things. The restrictions,
Give us one.
yeah, the restriction of fundings, Brazil being deprioritized, because, and we heard a lot about Brazil over the past years, as an example of reversing these autocratic trends. But I mean, I'm not getting into this, but it's not exactly like that. The challenges remain, but the challenge I would like to mention really briefly is more like related to a strategic one. That is, how can we shift from a reactive mode into a proactive mode? How can we really find ways, strategies, and specifically time to address the roots of this democratic backsliding and how people do not, and why people do not trust democracy anymore, because we are always reacting and fighting back and dealing with this crisis, and lots of nationally, I'm talking about Brazil, but we don't have time to really think it through and find and build strategies to tackle the roots of this, and that's what keeps me up at night, I would say.
I think that's very close to the question I wanted to start with, the way you just framed that, which is I'd like us to think constructively about what we can do to actually make things better and to change things, given the challenges that we're facing right now, which I think you've expressed very well, which are pressures not only on funding, but on the people who have been acting. They're exhausted, they're under threat and stress, even of death, certainly of imprisonment. But before we get into the positive, I want to go back for a second and think not about the past so much, but really about experiments that you all have tried that were really great ideas. This is a way to get us into the strategy, but didn't quite pan out. Because I think we need to learn about what works in certain kinds of situations and not in others, at certain times and not in others, in certain places and not in others. And what you've tried that people shouldn't try because they've already been done and not worked so well. So maybe you could give some examples of that if you have them. And you're looking at me, so I'm going to call on you. Be careful. I'm a teacher. Remember, if somebody looks at me, I call on
I'll
them.
hide at the back of the classroom next time. I think one of the things that has been tried, and I have to say in your wonderful country is also being tried now, is what is called by Timothy Snyder, obeying in advance. The anticipation that we have, that the authoritarian civic space is going to shut down. So in the interest of my organization, my funding, and I'm going to slow down, I'm going to tone down my rhetoric, I'm going to reduce my advocacy, I'm going to find networks to try and influence from the inside better behavior or to. I don't think that works. I think that feeds the beast.
Yeah, I think we can.
And you've seen some of the law firms in the U.S. who really did obey in advance. Once Paul Weiss was squeezed, the others went, okay, let's also comply. That doesn't work. I think we have to be much smarter about anticipating. I really completely agree with you. We have to be much smarter at anticipating over the long term and understanding the factors that are driving this kind of authoritarian behavior and citizens who like the promises that are being made to them by the authoritarians. We need to anticipate, and then we need to plan around how to counter it before it happens, or as it's happening, rather than wait until things have gone very bad and then say, now what do we do to pick up the pieces and reconstruct ourselves? So,
and let's follow
don't
that
obey
point in
advance.
depth a little bit as we proceed, because I think that's really important. Amelia, do you want to? Now you're looking at me, so.
Oh, well, good, yeah. I like to look at people when we're talking, right?
I don't mean to scare you off from looking at me.
No, I agree, silence is not an option.
Yeah.
And that is one very important thing. And that's why I was talking about, for instance, my home country, where despite exile...
Venezuela, right?
Yes, I was born and grew up in Venezuela. But despite exile and despite the efforts of trying to silence media, investigative journalists have found ways of doing it and showing that it's even in that context, it's possible, but not only possible, but necessary. There are other things that are not only tied to, like, well, let's keep our voices, let's keep documenting the stories, even that sometimes you don't have all the data in front of you or all the sources are ready and available. You need to do a lot of work to get there and to get the information. But it's tied to how do we connect and how do we tell the stories. The audience has shifted, and there are many things happening at the same time. So how do you connect with your audience? And sometimes we have seen, the investigations we do are so complex. And imagine telling someone about illicit financial flows and then offshore companies, and you're talking about something that can be very hard to grasp. And we always need to remember about why should we care and how that is affecting the day-to-day life of citizens. And that has been the lessons learned, because sometimes we were very technical in documenting everything and telling those stories, but the most effective investigations and the ones that people remember are the ones that were telling the people why should we care and how is this affecting your daily life.
So in talking about messaging, that makes me think of Flavia's organization and the attempts at civic education and trying to prepare citizens to protect democracy. Are there messages that you tried that didn't work, or processes that you tried that you felt weren't so successful?
Yes, as a coalition, we are really focused on, and we work with advocacy a lot, because there are this group of 200 civil society organizations that share knowledge, share strategies. And one of the things I think it is like a learning, and two things that didn't work and that doesn't work usually. The first one was at the beginning of Pacto, trying to bring together to welcome in some way in the coalition political leadership. We tried at the very beginning, because there was we had this commitment letters, because they were candidates at the time, so if they were elected, they could help us build the reforms we wanted to make the Brazilian political system. But then, as years passed, and we started that year this shift with this liberal president, we said, okay, we cannot do this. It doesn't work the way we thought it would. So that was a first learning. But also, in some ways, it is related to that, and I think it doesn't work, and it's something we as civil society, and as a society as a whole, in fact, we should be aware and mindful of, what doesn't work is not to distinguish what is the democratic camp, the democratic field, and the progressive and left camp. Because the democratic camp should accommodate, the right wing and even like
Be inclusive
conservatives.
of the...
Yeah, it should be about all this political spectrum. And historically, and in Brazil, of course, we have, and of course, we can dive into that, like a society and a political landscape with so many, with so much resentment and fights. But I think one of the things we cannot keep doing is thinking the progressive is equivalent to the democratic camp. Mm-hmm. Even though, I mean, I know it can mean different things according to the country, but in Brazil, I'm especially talking about we have to focus and value and cherish political and ideological pluralism when we're defending democracy.
Sirpa, I know you think a lot about how to bring government into this, and you do too, Aidan. So I'd love to hear from you two, sort of in response to Flavia's learning that there are problems with bringing government into the civic space.
Happy to do it. I'll use the example of my previous work. I was working in the Finnish Parliament, but director of the Finnish National Human Rights Institution. And in fact, on the issue of rule of law, because I had been living in Poland, but also I was in the Parliament, I heard the political rhetorics, which started many years before actually the election that then brought the far-right government into place. I was really trying to get different actors together. When you talk about rule of law, you easily exclude human rights groups. It becomes discussion of Minister of Justice, constitutional lawyers, maybe some justice related, but not the human rights group. So I was really trying to get into the discussion on rule of law as a national human rights institution, but also sort of wake up a little bit civil society, who was still working very traditionally on human rights issues, not really addressing the kind of the fundamental challenges that started to be visible. I still think we suffer with not having somehow worked effectively together, but it has gotten better. I think it's sadly a bit too late in many cases, at least for the moment. The government, of course, is always quite defensive, but it also even liberal governments that we had at that time were not acting early enough. So I think there was sort of slowness in understanding what was happening, and I think it's connected to that we didn't perhaps see closely enough what was happening in the society, and for sure we didn't look at the political discourse closely enough. So maybe not directly responding, but I think it's also something that I still feel that I was also guilty of not acting early enough, not strongly enough, and something we still have to work on. Really, if you look what has been, and I apologize, I mainly look at Europe now, mainly EU. If you really think who have been the biggest champions of fighting for rule of law, it's been a few academics who became kind of academic activists, of course working with civil society, and we're in the right place here. But I think for the rule of law, the issue was really that the traditional human rights work was not looking at those structural power-related issues early enough and didn't perhaps know how to address them. And we still have a long way to go. I think there has been progress, but we really need to work with all the actors together, including journalists, educational authorities. Of course, the governments bear the main responsibility, but you cannot count on governments. You need to, work with those who are holding them to account.
So I should give my hand away. One of the things that I study is the relationship between governments and citizens. Right. And what's important in making governments trustworthy and responsive is often civic action and citizens who are engaged in the ways that you all are trying to do. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, we, at least in my view, we do have to make government act correctly. Yes. Else we're not going to get a lot done. There's a limit to what the civic space can accomplish without a coalition with government actors and others. So I know this is part of what you think about as well, Aidan, so maybe you could speak to that a little. I couldn't resist, however, coming in and saying, I do think about this question a lot.
Yes, it's absolutely right. It's government which ultimately has the scale to change people's lives for the better, should they choose to do so, through fiscal measures, administrative engagement, legal, securing people's rights, the rights of the marginalized, the excluded populations. Government is the place where the action is. That's why the OGP really tries to help civil society surface those priorities in a way that then government can take on in policy and action and make a change. Just to go back, some of the experiments that happen tactically, what I learned also is sometimes we also have to be, as civil society organizations, sophisticated in not telling our governments everything. I did that much to my chagrin in Tanzania when we had a legal framework which protected civil society in the sense that we could be organized under the Companies Act, which is much harder for a government to go in there and delete your existence. But unfortunately, in a conversation when I was passionately defending the fact that we are independent, we are under the Companies Act, you can't touch us, etc., within 6 months they changed the law.
Yeah.
And I will always live, being very ashamed about the fact that, we were too obvious to the government who wanted to do something nefarious about how the law, as it then existed, protected us. The other thing that I think can be a temptation, especially now and in other countries, I've seen it in my own, and that is when resources are shrinking, civil society organizations then look to government for financial support. And that is deadly for your independence. So I'm going to teach you a Kiswahili word, gongo. This is English acronym for government organized NGOs. But in Kiswahili, gongo means illicit brew, moonshine, hooch. So whenever my colleagues will say, but let's talk to the government about getting government funds, I say, beware gongo. Because you will be seduced, your ability to hold government to account and to get them to act in ways that are, pro-processes, etc., will be diminished if you're going to get government funding. It's a very dicey, precarious place to go.
Thank you. Amelia, your organization tries to hold government accountable by revealing information, and you are independent and you're not dependent on government particularly. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this relationship, how you try to make government better using civil society and independent journalism.
Yes, and not because I'm being nostalgic, but I will go back a bit in time, and I will go back to a case and an investigation I was part of at my previous job at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists that basically shaped a lot of the things that we as investigative journalists do nowadays. And that was called the Panama Papers.
Yep.
So back in 2016, 370 journalists investigated together a trove of more than 11.2 million records, financial secrets that involve politicians, but also organized crimes and big money laundering operations affecting all sorts of people around the world. And there are many things that we learned from there, but what was interesting about that coalition and when we published those stories in media all around the world is that in months, there were over 150 responses in 79 countries. 6,520 people and companies were investigated. And until today, $1.3 billion have been recovered by governments independently after journalists did their investigations and published their stories around the world as a direct result of the investigations of the stories, including both tax revenue and fines. So that was one of the largest impacts investigative journalists has had. So what did we learn from there? And we see efforts at different scale. So collaboration, the power of people. We are under attack, and a journalist alone can be heavily threatened by any power that they are investigating. But when you are dozens, hundreds. The largest came afterwards. That was the largest at that time in history. Some years later, we had over 600 journalists from 110 countries investigating what was called the Pandora Papers. But even at different scales, after that, many networks were born. So we have networks in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, all around the world investigating together. That mitigates and reduces risks. But it also helps fight the problems of access to information, because sometimes you might not find the information in your country, but it's available in another country, and having the colleagues who have the access to the sources and have the availability to basically work together with you basically elevates the work that we do.
Does that work with reporting as well, in the sense that you can't report something in your own country, but you could feed it to another reporter in another country to reveal it?
Well, that's a different level. It works, but like this is a different level of collaboration where everyone is brought as an equal, and still you consider sometimes how to publish strategically to reduce risks, and how do you credit the journalists. Sometimes in most extreme cases, it's a coalition that gets the credit and we know who is behind, but here the names of the 370 were out. So, but other things that were very important is the power of tech. And we don't talk a lot about it, but this wouldn't have been possible without technology. Yep. And then how to use tech strategically. Sometimes tech can be a problem, but for journalism, tech has also helped basically mine millions of records, check and connect the dots. So we have used graph databases, we have used data mining, we have also used, at that time not, but later on, machine learning to connect the information, but then you need to fact check, verify, and connect that with human sources, go to public records, so the documents that you get is just the beginning. But it takes time. Other tools and later on that have been used, satellite imagery these days is amazingly used by investigative journalists. It has been used to uncover illegal mining operations in the Amazonian rainforest or war crimes in areas where journalists can't access and document what is happening and is going on. The rest is also connected to what I do nowadays too, which is the training. These topics are so complex that we need to understand how they work. So we need to build our capacity. So we're constantly sharing knowledge on how illicit financial flows work, but also how climate change works, how AI works, so that we can basically understand and work together on those investigations.
So Amelia, you've already started us on the next sort of topic, so thank you for that, which is really to think about strategically, what can each of your organizations do individually? What do you suggest to do collaboratively? And as we talk about strategy, I'd also like to hear a little bit about not just coalitions and networks within your own area, but for example, Amelia, does your group form coalitions with non-journalist groups in civil society? Well, so as each of you talk, if you'll speak to that, but I'll let you start.
Yeah, no, and like talking about tech particularly, for example, there have been very successful collaborations with academics and other groups that are experts on the tech side of things, and they have like supported significantly, and journalists have developed their own tools and open source tools to basically do this kind of work and do the mining and keep the information secure. So that's one that stands out to me. And then for other types of investigations, one thing is the expert sources, but those type of collaborations, we need to always be very careful so that the independence is not at risk. Right. But like the tag academia, there have been great collaborations with academics too, investigative journalists and academics. And I will leave it there so that others can speak, but I think the tech development at the investigative journalism level wouldn't have happened with the generous support of tech experts, and like they come from independent organizations. This is not big tech. This is actually independent technologists, data scientists, some in academia that are working closely with journalists.
So Flavia, what are the strategic issues as you see them, and what kinds of coalition building or actions do you think are important as part of that strategic vision? Yes, the same question will come to the two of you.
Yes, as a coalition, the essence of Pacto is building. It's building this collective intelligence. So it's interesting because as a broad coalition, we do have members of Pacto. They are civil society organizations working with different agendas. There are journalist associations, organizations that work with all the causes you can imagine. So, and within the coalition, there are other like smaller collaborations that are stimulated and formed as well. Because of course we have this huge network, but I mean, we don't work, and this is something I'll talk about also later, we don't work, for example, with consensus decision making. Because it would be impossible to move forward if you depended on consensus to work. But also because of that, we create a really flexible environment within the coalition, so different initiatives can happen and be built, developed at the same time. We have a secretariat that leads and facilitates this work within the coalition, but building different ways, different partnerships and collaborations within the coalition is one way to go. Also, and our major efforts and maybe the most important strategy project we've done in our history has been the efforts on defending the integrity of elections, when we also allied and created strategic alliances with bank association, the private sector, academia, of course, and we had like this wide range of actors from all sectors of Brazilian civil society to stand together for the rule of law. And
are you in alliance at all with any international groups across borders?
Absolutely, and that would be the third one. I would like to mention that, especially over the past 3 years, we've been engaged in many different initiatives, especially focused on strengthening the transnational pro-democracy movement, international pro-democracy movement, through transnational collaborations. And we've been sharing our experiences and learnings. We do have also, I don't have it here, but at Pacto we've been trying also to organize and systematize our own learnings and experiences, because we know, and over the past years, civil society players all around the world have been reaching out to us in order to get to know more on how to build this kind of coalition, broad and cross-ideological. It is something rare, rare to be built. I haven't seen it elsewhere, like the way Pacto works. Of course, there are really important coalitions in different countries in different ways, but this has something, building such a broad and long-term coalition, it is something that has interested civil society actors all around the world. We've been trying to just share this knowledge, this experience, and strengthen the pro-democracy movement worldwide.
Sirpa, I know you're at a strategic moment in your work, so maybe you could share some of the strategy thinking you're doing.
I'll try. Of course, I'm still relatively new to the Fundamental Rights Agency, 1 year, and we're trying to reform while things are... What a year, exactly. Trying to sort of reform, change the approach while everything is moving extremely fast. And again, my focus is and has to be at EU. Of course, EU has internal and external dimension, which is one of the issues somehow we should be able to address. We can only work on EU, internal law and policy, plus accession countries, fortunately. But there's external dimension dealing with security, foreign policy, including human rights. These are quite disconnected. This is something we are trying to address by providing some support to the external dimension as well, because I think this lack of coherence is really eating the credibility of EU as a major human rights actor and donor that it has been. So that's one aspect. the more difficult one. Perhaps the more easier one is where we have clearly a mandate is to work on EU level law and policy. As many of you perhaps know, EU is this commission is very rapidly simplifying or deregulating, and some of these will concern directly NGO funding, business and human rights, corporate sustainability, due diligence. So we're trying to keep up with these omnibuses, but they are coming very fast. At the same time, we should also at the national level work exactly on the same issues, and this hasn't been happening strategically enough. I think often in many member states it's difficult to follow the EU sort of decision-making at the national level. So this is something I think if we could be more strategic, us following and communicating in real time with the national level, we could perhaps stop some of these really threatening ideas that are at the moment being implemented. We're looking at the next 7 years funding, multi-annual financial framework. We have been trying to influence it so that civil society funding would continue, the conditionalities would continue. But if it's just us and not the national level pushing their governments, I think we have, not as great chances. So I think this working at different levels, while it's very difficult in a fast-moving, landscape, we absolutely have to get there, and this is something we are trying to do. And in this case, I think civil society is very important. But for example, the corporate sustainability, the green agenda, it's going down the drain at the EU, and nobody seems to be able to stop it. But we have to try. And of course, Commission makes proposals, but there is a parliament, there is a process, so there is always time to act. Same concerns equality issues, horizontal equality directive withdrawn. Again, we need to do something about these things, but it has to be EU level, national level at the same time. And I feel that there we have a particular responsibility. Many other ideas what we can do better, but this I think is a key, because this is where Fundamental Rights Agency would have, I think, best added value, being an EU level actor.
One of the things I've heard from all of you is how nimble you have to be. That the landscape is constantly changing, the funding landscape, the people landscape, the political landscape, and so you really have to keep your organizations on their toes, which must be exhausting for each of you, as well as you pointed out for your members.
By collecting data and trying to be evidence-based at the same time, so yeah. Not easy.
Not easy. Aidan, do you want to give us a strategic vision for your group? And
yes.
maybe for all of us?
Let me try and share some thinking. I think there are two audiences, at least the OGP is trying to get much better at engaging with. One, and I'm very proud to point to my colleague, I think he's still there. Hi, Blair. Blair, wave your hand. Blair and the Accountability Lab are doing some amazing work with young people from Liberia to Nepal to, all over the place to get them engaged in their civic responsibilities, but also, I think, find joy and meaningful fulfillment out of it. I think we need to get more and more young people involved in this thing, in work that we do, in manner that speaks to them. They can sometimes put us to shame in Kenya, in Nigeria, when they go out into the streets and say, this budget doesn't work for me. While we sit in, comfortable places and complain about the budget, they say, this doesn't work for me. They go out in the streets and they risk life and limb to do that. Let's continue to encourage them to do that. The second group of people, thank you. The second group is business.
Yeah.
I think we need to make a much stronger case that transparency, rule of law, leads to predictability and stability of the investment climates that they want to go in and make money. I don't think we're making that case strong enough, and we need to be smarter about making that case. In partnership between Open Contracting Partnership and OGP, Ukraine has done some amazing things on open contracting, saved billions of dollars in procurement. More small and medium enterprises are able to access Ukraine's public contracts. These are the kinds of arguments we need to make. Côte d'Ivoire has been a member of the OGP for the last 10 years. Their economic trajectory has solidified, stabilized. They're well on their way to becoming I think it's an upper middle income country in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. Even their credit rating was improved in December last year. Partly, and I'm going to claim some of it, because they're members of the Open Government Partnership. They made their resources, they made government more predictable and attractive to investment. So the final sort of strategic thought is that we must not lose sight of our normative anchors, right? The values which we really hold very dear and which we espouse. But we cannot just live on the normative anchor. We need to be able to articulate it in a utilitarian fashion. It's what you were saying earlier about the narrative. Why does this matter to me to be involved in these sorts of things? So let us have unshakable normative anchors, but I think we need to be nimble about how we articulate it in a sort of in a utilitarian fashion.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions in a second. I just want to quickly summarize some of what I heard. When I think about participation in the civic space, I think about voting in elections, but I also think about protest and demonstrations, which you mentioned, Aidan, just now. But what I'm impressed with what all of you are doing is in addition to that, which is not, it's a supplement to that, or important to keep things going in addition to protest and getting people out on the streets, are all the kinds of small and big actions that have to be taken, the networks that have to be created, the education and the messaging that has to be done around a whole range of issues, the ways in which governments can actually be involved in this, if we think about it strategically, and business. So I think this was a really helpful discussion in making us think about the multiple levels on which civic engagement can occur, and in which all of us can be engaged. All of us are in some piece of that action. So I want to thank you before we opened it to questions. So we have about 10 minutes maybe for questions before I'm going to, I know that because my watch just told me it was time to stand. So I know it's 10 minutes of. I'm delaying here for a second so somebody, oh, you have a microphone, David, good. Betsy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Excellent. Betsy Anderson, formerly with the World Justice Project, and delighted to be back with my friends here and now with the Basel Institute on Governance. And my question is really maybe principally for Flavia and Amelia, but I'd welcome inputs from the rest of you. And it's about collective action. And I want to just name a challenge that we face is that, the civil society space and media, these are competitive markets and communities, competing for funding, in the media competing to break the story. And one of the things that's remarkable about the narratives you've been sharing is that you've found ways to set that competition aside and foster collective action. And I'd be interested in the strategies of trust building and collegiality that have made that work.
Will I take a couple of questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? We'll take 2 questions, 3 questions. So this man here. And then there's someone in the way back will be number 3, and then I'll find the other people who raised their hands.
My name is Udo Jude Ilo. I work for the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. So I have 1 question, 1 comment, quickly. So a lot of times when we try to protect the civic space, we talk to ourselves, we work with ourselves. And we have a little bit of difficulty trying to build a broader coalition beyond just the traditional players, like the business community, the entertainment industry, diaspora community, and all of that. And in my own experience, it's been really, really difficult working with the business community, even though their interest is very much at risk when the systems don't work. So I want to see if you can share some perspective in how you've been able to build broader coalitions beyond the traditional practitioners within the space. The second point is the language of engagement with government. I really liked what Aidan said about saying too much, but I also wanted to hear about how we can find a much more collaborative language where we do not immediately demonize the people we want to influence. And if you've had some experiences in finding the right kind of balance that doesn't celebrate injustice, but as well as also provide room for engagement. Thank you.
And the third question back there, and then we'll give you all a chance to respond.
Morning. My name is Caroline Ford from the International Development Research Center. My question to you is, when civic space is divided, civic space also helped win elections that are anti-rights, anti-justice, and rule by law as opposed to rule of law. So I'm interested in your reflections in terms of, we've been protecting civic space, thinking that civic space is going to be pro-rights, and civic space is polarized. And do you have any thoughts on the future of protecting civic space when doing that is actually giving platforms to those who espouse anti-rights narratives? Thanks.
Why don't I give each of you a chance to respond to whatever of those questions you feel most comfortable responding. Flavie, shall we start with you? We'll just go this way, and then the next time we'll go a different way.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Like, really great questions and great challenges, in fact, on building trust among these different actors within coalitions and civil society. I would say it is a huge challenge, and it demands really hard work on a daily basis. In our case, for Pacto, we do have, and there's something when people reach out to me to know how to build this kind of coalition, one of the key aspects I mention is having a full-time team, a full-time secretariat facilitating these relationships and building this safe space. We have to listen every day and really carefully to the members, and creating and building opportunities, spaces where they can bond, where they can know each other, even though they disagree on a lot of things. And some of the organizations that are part of Pacto, for example, they used to be adversaries in their own programmatic agendas, I would say. They don't agree at all with their own, with the approach on their own causes, for example. And we know there's, in some ways, some mistrust among them, but we build like this opportunities for them to really get to know each other, and also to focus on the scope of work Pacto is working on, because we know and that's why also not only we don't work with consensus, but we don't as a coalition we don't focus on the programmatic agendas, because on policy on things that would easily divide them. It is mostly about the structure and the way the democratic processes and rules, and because we know if we go deeper in the policy, it wouldn't work. So creating safe space for them to bond, and also, it's valid also for multi-sector coalitions. In our experience, is more circumstantial ones. For example, in the elections. This is why being a coalition is also a great strategy, because I was not the one that could reach out, that had the political capital to reach out to the president of the bank association in Brazil. But someone in my coalition does have this capital, and then we create like this huge network to access power and to reach in a more broad and deeper way the players we wanted to reach.
Thank you. We're running out of time, which is why I'm going to make you all be very brief here. Sorry about that. There are lots of answers to these questions. Amelia?
Yes. Well, I will mix a bit some of the answers then, trying to be brief. But trust is about people. And when you're talking about collaboration, we were talking from the beginning about the power of people. And we were talking about the challenges. So what we learned as journalists is not the time for egos. It's time for leaving the egos aside. And how do you do that? How do you build trust? There are different ways. First, you need to have a set of rules clear from the beginning, so that if anyone is breaking the rules, then you can hold someone to account. So you can't just say, let's collaborate, but you need to understand how and how it's going to work and what are the ground rules. Some of the things that have made the most collaborations successful is what we called then back in the days also radical sharing. So we share everything with everyone. We are transparent with our peers. So doesn't matter which country someone is from, everyone has access to the same information, and that powers up the collaboration. So transparency rules, and having someone that helps bring people together. So sometimes we talk about the people, but the coordination is as important as the people. So being able to coordinate and share and making sure that
there's a lot of similarity in what you're saying. Yep.
And last thing, which was like, sometimes, you're worried about, what are we up to, when we are, I think for us as journalists, the important thing is we are not propaganda machines, we are journalists. So we stand for public interest, for holding powers to account, and basically, if there are people affected by things, and that connects with public interest. So every time we're picking and seeing a story, is this of public interest? Are the people affected by this? Are victims? Is this something that someone is trying to hide that actually is breaking any regulation or is affecting our community? So that's when we start and decide, are we going to work on this? And then the standards, which means we just don't publish a story without having gathered the facts, without having gathered the documents, and having done the whole work, because that's what investigative journalism is about, and that's why it's not a one-day story. It takes time and resources.
Aidan.
Business. In Tanzania in 2022, the government passed a fiscal measure to tax mobile money transfer. One of our biggest mobile money network operators, Vodacom, saw its market share of mobile money transfer shrink by about 15% within 6 months. We surveyed, against government will, the citizens and asked them about taxation and other measures. Vodacom was very nervous about going public with what was happening. We were able to find this data because they have to file their returns every quarter, their profits. We fought for the right of citizens to express their displeasure with this tax measure. We launched the survey, after which Vodacom was very happy to publish the fact that they'd lost market share. What am I saying here? The entry point to business is to be very clear that this is of business interest for them to get involved in. That's why they do CSR, because with CSR, they will gain market share for good, positive branding. So that's the entry point we found when government acted in a way that was inimical to business interest, and they understood why it was important for people to be able to express their views. Language about government, I completely agree with you. Try not to demonize. Government is not monolithic, civil service is not monolithic. There are always allies that one can work with. Find those allies and work with them. Sometimes you've got to provide information, insight. You can legitimize some of the difficult things that they're saying inside their civil servants circles and say, actually, these civil society organizations are on board with this. It's good politically, it's good policy-wise. So tactically find those government civil servants who can be honest. But the other thing is, don't expose them. Mm-hmm. Don't say, we're working with that particular permanent secretary, because they'll be moved the next day. So in your working with government officials, your allies, also protect their identities, because after all, the ultimate goal is to improve how government behaves.
Sirpa.
One aspect that hasn't been mentioned is how much has moved to online. I mean, we talk about polarization of civil society. There will always be different views. But what we are trying to deal with is also the online aspect of hate and disinformation. As perhaps many of you know, EU has fairly new Artificial Intelligence Act. So within that, we are working with businesses. We are written into that act. So we are working on high-risk artificial intelligence. I have no time to go to details. With the Digital Services Act, we are trying to address some of the platform issues. And again, of course, it's a business that's running the platforms. So we are mainly focusing on the different aspects of fundamental rights impact assessment, working with the Commission for the transposition of this and implementation of this. These have potential to help with some of these issues, but only if they are implemented fully. And that's why I was drawing the attention to also the sort of the risk of simplification, even deregulation, some of this that has been built, and also perhaps then a fairly sort of loose monitoring of how they are actually implemented. So this is something we have to watch carefully, because much of what we're talking about is happening online. Our research, we have plenty of research, shows massive hate, proliferation of hate across all the platforms.
So let's...
Margaret,
yes.
can I disturb you? I think you need to answer Caroline Ford's question.
Well,
you studied the relationship between state and citizens. Her question was really about civic space for the anti-rights agenda.
Well, I was going to.
Great.
I wasn't going to leave that question unanswered.
Great.
I think one of the things to keep in mind about polarization is we've been here before. Here we are in Warsaw. You look at the history of Warsaw, lots of splits. I'm old enough to have been a child under McCarthyism, to have marched in civil rights, to have marched in the anti-war movement. Polarization of an extreme sort in all of those cases. What I take away from that is that we're not going to necessarily always come to agreement. We have to, one, develop institutional arrangements and try to keep them strong, which is what I think we're all doing in our different ways, that protect us against the worst abuses of that polarization and give people an opportunity to engage with each other and to learn to not necessarily trust each other, but to know that the other has good intentions and good motivations, and that you gotta listen and you gotta somehow find some common ground. But the other thing I think is the big takeaway is this is a never-ending battle. You think you've won, as we all have at various moments, and it all starts again. So I think the big lesson about polarization is it's here right now. It will return again in the future once we, if we can, resolve this particular moment. And so it's very important to have organizations like all of yours, and I am so appreciative to the work that you do, to be standing up for the rule of law, for democracy, for civic space, and ensuring that it continues despite the pressures against it right now. And with that, I think we should turn to the film, and then we can close.
In West Africa and the world, journalists are often the last line of defense for democracy. That is why we started this project, to use independent journalism to expose corruption and defend the rule of law and build stronger democracies in our countries. We launched our Investigative Journalism Initiative in 2021 to fight impunity, defend rights, and challenge the misuse of power in West Africa. Let me walk you through the impact we have had in Ghana. We've produced over 100 reports on corruption, human rights, public health, and more. We are not just telling stories, we are changing outcomes. When the president claimed his officials were declaring their access, we investigated. Turns out, over 100 hadn't, including top ministers and judges. After our reports, nearly 300 rushed to comply. We exposed a fraudulent petroleum contract costing Ghana $2 million a month. After our publication, the president suspended it and Parliament blocked payment. Ultimately, the deal was cancelled. We revealed bribery in school admissions, fake COVID test schemes, and how uncertified medicines made it to air. Our stories led to arrests, reforms, and accountability. We are not stopping there. We have trained 33 young reporters through our Investigative Journalism Fellowship, equipping West Africa's next generation of truth tellers. We are honored to have been recognized as a 2024 World Justice Challenge winner in the Media and Information category.
Thank you for being a great panel, and thank you for being a great audience. And please take this as a call to action and to continuing to stand up for the rule of law, for democracy, and for the civic space. Thank you all.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. That was
Very
good.
well done.